We look at the moon now, and it seems romantic. A silver coin tossed into the night sky, a backdrop for poets and lovers. But in the summer of 1969, the moon wasn't a romance. It was a monolith. It was a terrifying, dead, airless desert hanging 250,000 miles above our heads, looking down at a world that was tearing itself apart at the seams. Think about the year 1969. The streets of America were bleeding from Vietnam protests. The Cold War wasn't just a political chess game. It was an existential dread that you felt in your bones every time you turned on the television. The Soviet Union had already put a sphere into orbit, a dog into space, a man into the void. They were winning, and the United States was desperate. President John F. Kennedy had set a deadline 8 years prior. He didn't live to see it approach, but his promise hung over NASA like an ultimatum. Before this decade is out,
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
to keep that promise, human beings had to build a machine that defied reason. They built the Saturn V, 363 feet of raw, unadulterated power. It wasn't just a rocket, it was a controlled explosion looking for a place to happen. And on July 16, 1969, 3 men sat on top of that explosion, waiting for someone to light the fuse. Who were they? We treat them like demigods now, carved out of marble. But if you look closer, they were just men. Brilliant, yes. Highly disciplined, absolutely. But fragile. Neil Armstrong, the commander, a quiet, introverted test pilot from Ohio. He wasn't a cowboy. He was an engineer who happened to fly. If you asked Neil a question, he would sometimes wait 10 seconds before answering, calculating the variables in his head. He had looked death in the eye more than once, in the skies over Korea, and when his Gemini 8 capsule spun out of control in orbit. He didn't panic. He survived. Buzz Aldrin, the doctor of astronautics, a man of complex intellect and intense emotion. He understood the mechanics of orbital rendezvous better than anyone alive. He was the analytical engine of the crew. And Michael Collins, the lonely sentinel, the man who would have to stay behind in the command module, orbiting the moon alone, knowing that if his crewmates crashed on the surface, he would have to fly back to Earth completely by himself. He later wrote that his biggest fear wasn't dying, it was coming home alone as a marked man for the rest of his life. There is a strange loneliness to the morning of a launch. You eat your steak and eggs, you get bolted into a suit that isolates you from the world's air, and you drive out to a tower where everyone else is leaving. Hundreds of technicians are backing away, driving miles into the distance. They lock you in, they close the hatch. Below you are 6 million pounds of liquid oxygen, kerosene, and liquid hydrogen. You are sitting on a bomb that has been assembled by the lowest bidder in a government contract. In the final minutes, Armstrong's heart rate was a steady 77 beats per minute. Think about that. He was about to be launched into the cosmos on a pillar of fire, and his heart was beating slower than a man jogging in the park. That is what made Neil Armstrong who he was. The numbers don't do it justice. We can talk about 7.5 million pounds of thrust. We can talk about 5 F1 engines consuming 15 tons of fuel every single second. But numbers don't shake your teeth. When the Saturn V ignited, it didn't just make a sound. It created an earthquake. Windows shattered miles away. The air in Florida turned to jelly. CBS anchor Walter Cronkite, a man who had seen everything, could only stammer into his microphone, his voice trembling as the building shook around him. Inside the capsule, it felt like being inside the jaws of a giant animal. The vibration was so intense that the instruments blurred before their eyes. If something went wrong in those first 2 minutes, the escape tower would have to yank them away, a maneuver that carried its own terrifying risks. But the machine worked. Stage 1 dropped away into the Atlantic. Stage 2 ignited, pressing them harder into their seats. Then Stage 3. 11 minutes later, the noise died. The shaking stopped. And suddenly, there was no weight. They were in low Earth orbit, but they weren't staying. A few hours later, the third stage engine fired one more time. Translunar injection. They broke the shackles of Earth's gravity and began a 3-day fall through the dark toward a target that was moving at 2,000 miles an hour. Spaceflight in Hollywood is clean, spacious, and dramatic. The reality of Apollo 11 was 3 men crammed into a space no bigger than the inside of a station wagon for 3 days straight. The air smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of the environmental control system. They slept in shifts. They listened to the hiss of the radio. Outside, there was no blue sky, no weather, no sound. If you looked out one window, the sun would blind you with a raw, fierce light that never changes. Out the opposite window, there was only the abyss. On the third day, they passed into the shadow of the moon. When you see the moon from Earth, it looks flat. When you see it up close, it is a nightmare of geometry. It is a chaotic graveyard of craters, valleys, and sharp ridges that have never been softened by a single drop of rain or a gust of wind. It looks hostile. It looks like a place where living things do not belong. They fired their engine to slow down and enter lunar orbit. If that engine burned too short, they would swing around the moon and fly off into a permanent orbit around the sun, lost forever. If it burned too long, they would crash into the lunar far side. The engine fired perfectly. They were in position. The next morning, Armstrong and Aldrin crawled through the narrow tunnel into the lunar module, codenamed Eagle. Michael Collins stayed behind in Columbia. Collins looked out his window and watched his friends drift away. He checked his radio. As he swung around to the far side of the moon, he lost contact with Earth. No radio, no television, no human voice. He was more isolated than any human being had ever been since the dawn of time. Behind him was the black void. Below him was a dead world. And ahead of him was the weight. This is where the history books gloss over the terror. The descent of the Eagle was not a smooth glide. It was a chaotic, high-stakes gamble where every second brought a new way to die. At 46,000 feet, the computer began to scream. "Program alarm 1202, Armstrong's voice cracked over the radio. A 1202 alarm. Nobody in the cockpit knew exactly what it meant. In mission control, a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales had seconds to make a choice. If he called an abort, the mission was over, years of work thrown away. If he didn't, the computer might freeze and the Eagle would plunge into the moon. Bales realized the computer was just overloaded. It was handling too much radar data, but was still doing its job. "We're go on that alarm," he whispered. But the universe wasn't done with them. As Armstrong looked out the triangular window, he realized the computer was flying them straight into a crater the size of a football field, surrounded by boulders as big as cars. If they landed there, the module would tip over, the ascent engine would be ruined, and they would be stranded until their oxygen ran out. Armstrong did what only a master pilot could do. He took manual control. He tilted the Eagle forward, gunned the engine, and chose to fly over the crater, searching for a flat spot in a wasteland of rocks. In Houston, the capsule communicator, Charlie Duke, watched the fuel clock tick down. 60 seconds of fuel remaining. The Eagle was kicking up a massive cloud of lunar dust, blinding Armstrong. He couldn't see the ground. He was flying by the feel of his seat, trying to stop the ship from drifting sideways. 30 seconds remaining. If the engine cut out now, they would drop like a stone. Mission Control was dead silent. Men stopped breathing. Then, a faint light on the dashboard illuminated. A probe dangling from the landing gear had touched the dust. "Contact light," Aldrin murmured. Armstrong shut down the engine. The roar ceased. The dust settled. We remember the words. We have them printed on T-shirts and carved into monuments. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. And yes, he meant to say a man, even if the static swallowed the word. But look past the words. Look at the image itself. 600 million people, 1/5 of the world's population at the time, were watching that grainy, ghostly image. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years stood on porches together, looking up at the moon, then back at their television screens. For one brief, shining moment, the tribalism of our species evaporated. We weren't Americans or Soviets, rich or poor. We were humans, watching our own kind walk on another world. What they found there was a world of stark beauty. No colors, only shades of gray, charcoal, and dazzling white. The shadows were pitch black because there was no air to scatter the light. And the smell. When they finally came back inside and took off their helmets, they noticed a smell clinging to their suits. It smelled like spent gunpowder or wet ashes after a fire. The smell of the wilderness of space. They left a plaque attached to the landing stage. It didn't boast of military victory. It read, "We came in peace for all mankind." The return was just as dangerous. The fiery re-entry into Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, where the heat shield reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. But they made it. When they were paraded through the streets of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, something strange happened. The crowds didn't yell, "You Americans did it!" They yelled, "We did it." More than half a century has passed since that July night. The machines that took them there are now museum pieces, covered in plexiglass, smelled by tourists in Washington. We haven't been back to that dust since 1972. But those footprints at Tranquility Base remain. In the vacuum of space, with no wind to erase them, they will stay there for 1,000,000 years. Long after our cities have fallen, long after our languages are forgotten, those tracks in the gray dust will remain. A monument to the time when a flawed, violent, beautiful species built a ladder to the stars and had the courage to climb it.